Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are strapping in for what is, well, basically a high-altitude philosophical wrestling match against skepticism.
That's a good way to put it. We're looking at a theory called epistemological dogmatism, and it's a really prominent anti-skeptical strategy.
Right. And this school of thought, it believes it's found a kind of fast track to justification, one that lets it completely bypass the usual long-winded debate with the skeptic.
Exactly. The sources we're looking at today are all focused on dogmatism's most radical claim.
Which is?
That skepticism is a philosophical disease, and that because of that, we can simply refuse to engage with it.
Wow. Okay, so that's a bold move. Our mission for this deep dive is pretty critical then. We need to analyze the arguments, the logical steps, and, the internal consistency of this whole dismissive approach.
That's the core question. Can dogmatism really secure our common sense beliefs without having to defend its own standards? Or is that engagement with the skeptic ultimately unavoidable?
Before we go any further, we have to define our terms. What exactly is epistemological dogmatism?
Okay, so at its heart, it's an internalist, neo-Moorean theory of justification.
Neo-Moorean as in G.E. Moore.
As in G.E. Moore, exactly. Its big innovation is all about how we get warrant or justification for our basic perceptual beliefs. I see a tree, this table is brown, that sort of thing.
And what's the innovation?
It holds that this perceptual warrant is immediate. It's based purely on what it calls experiential seemings. Seemings. The whole idea to secure that justification right there at the ground level. You don't need an active defense. You don't need a complex chain of reasoning. No higher order justification is required at all.
So the immediate feeling that something is true, that is the justification. That sounds incredibly intuitive. It's like they're trying to formally ground what we all feel instinctively. If something looks red, you're justified in believing it's red. End of story.
That's the appeal. It's meant to be the common sense philosophy.
Okay, let's unpack the mechanism behind this. The whole system is apparently built on one single foundational rule. You called it PC earlier. What's the precise definition?
Right. The foundational principle, PC, is stated like this. If it seems to S that P, then in the absence of defeaters, us thereby has at least some degree of justification for believing that P.
Okay, that sounds pretty straightforward. If it looks like a duck, you can believe it's a duck, unless you have a reason not to.
It looks deceptively straightforward, yes.
Yeah.
But that single sentence really codifies this entire liberal approach to warrant that we're talking about.
You mentioned two core features there, immediate and defeasible. Let's spend some time on that because that combination seems to be what separates dogmatism from almost every other foundationalist theory out there.
It is. So when we say immediate, we mean that the justification doesn't rest on any other justified belief you might hold. It's completely non-inferential.
So it's not based on a logical deduction.
Not at all.
Yeah.
And it's non-doxastic, which means it's not based on another belief. For instance, your warrant for believing the wall is blue doesn't come from some prior justified belief like my eyes are working correctly or I'm not being deceived by an evil demon right now.
So the experience itself, the seeming, is the complete and direct source of the warrant.
Yes. It's meant to leap that gap, moving directly from the raw sensation to justification without any cognitive middleman.
Okay, but then there's the other side of it, defeasible.
Crucially, yes. This warrant is defeasible, which just means the justification is prima facie. It's a starting point. It holds on the surface, but it's ready to be overridden.
So if you then get new information...
Exactly. If you subsequently learn that you, say, took a hallucinogenic drug an hour ago or that there's some tricky colored lighting in the room, that immediate warrant you had for the blue wall is... poof, it's gone. It's lost.
So that built-in fallibility is what keeps it from being, a claim to absolute certainty.
Right. It prevents dogmatism from being an outright form of infallibilism. It's a more nuanced position. It allows for this immediate justification that can then be rationally retracted if you get new evidence.
I think we really need to nail down this concept of a seeming. You were very clear that a seeming is not a belief. What's the actual distinction there?
It's a critical distinction.
Yeah.
A doxastic attitude is an active mental state, like a belief or a judgment or an active acceptance of a proposition.
I have decided that this is true.
Exactly. A seeming, on the other hand, is a direct, phenomenal awareness that something is the case. It's part of your raw experience. Philosophers often describe it as having a distinctive forcefulness and assertiveness.
Of coursefulness.
Yeah, sometimes I call it felt veridicality. the feeling of truthiness, you could say. Think about looking at an optical illusion, like the Miller-Lire illusion with the two lines.
The one with the arrows where one line looks longer than the other.
Right. Even when you've measured them and you know for a fact that they are the same length, it still seems to you that one is longer.
So your belief is they are equal, but the seeming, the raw visual experience is they are unequal.
Precisely. The visual experience is still asserting that one is longer, even if your rational mind rejects that assertion. The dogmatist argues that it's this assertive presentation, this phenomenal state, that carries the immediate warrant, not the belief or the judgment that comes after.
It's a foundational input, not an intellectual output.
You got it. And this whole structure, this reliance on seemings, forces dogmatism to endorse what's called the liberal conception of warrant. This is a really critical part of their project.
Why is this liberalism so central?
Well, liberalism holds that the experiential seeming provides warrant for a proposition, let's call it edel, entirely independent of any antecedent warrants or background beliefs. It's a radical rejection of the idea that you need to check your premises before you can trust your perceptions.
And this is how they try to solve skepticism right out of the gate.
It is. If the justification is truly immediate, there's no gap, no space for the skeptic to jump in and insert their doubt about the reliability of your senses before you get the justification.
And this stands in direct opposition to the other camp, conservatism, which is famously associated with philosophers like Crispin Wright.
Direct opposition. The conservative view says that you can only get perceptual warrant for tie dollars if you already have some kind of antecedent independent warrant that supports the reliability of your senses.
So for the conservative, before I can be justified in believing the wall is blue based on seeing it, I first need some reason to believe my eyes are trustworthy.
Yes. Without that background warrant, you can't get justification from perception. So for the conservative, if a skeptic challenges the reliability of your senses, you have to answer that challenge first before you can use your senses to justify anything about the external world.
And dogmatism says that's just too demanding.
They say it's an impossible standard. It's a concession to skepticism that ultimately makes justification impossible for anyone.
So the stakes of this debate are, well, they're massive. Liberalism is trying to save common sense by saying the world gives you the warrant immediately, and conservatism is trying to save epistemic hygiene by saying, no, you have to justify your methods first.
That sums up the foundational difference perfectly. And that difference is precisely why dogmatism so enthusiastically embraces the neo-Moorean stance.
G.E. Moore's famous, or maybe infamous, proof of the external world. The one where he just holds up his hand.
And says, here's one hand, and then holds up the other and says, and here is another.
Therefore, two hands exist, and therefore the external world exists. It's an argument that has always felt a bit like a philosophical joke.
To many, yes. But dogmatists view Moore's proof as perfectly successful. Not just successful, but cogent. And the reason they can do that is because their liberal warrant structure bypasses all the traditional criticisms.
Okay, let's look at the argument itself. It's formally sound, right?
It is. The structure is simple. Premise 1M. I know here is a hand. Let's call that KH. Premise 2M. If I know here is a hand, then I know skepticism is false. So, KSH. And the conclusion, 3M. Therefore, I know skepticism is false, KSH.
The crucial move here is the use of the epistemic closure principle, the idea that if you are justified in believing P and you know that P entails Q, then you are also justified in believing Q.
Exactly. The dogmatist claims the immediate perceptual warrant for here is a hand is basic and direct. It doesn't require any prior proof that you aren't, say, a brain in a vat.
Right.
Therefore, that warrant just transfers cleanly via closure to the denial of the skeptical hypothesis. The warrant for the hand is basic, so the deduced denial of the brain in a vat scenario is also justified. It's a clean sweep.
But this is where the conservative view just slams on the brakes. Traditionally, why do critics say Moore's proof fails? This is where the concept of transmission failure comes in, right?
This is the absolute crux of the disagreement. Critics argue that Moore's proof suffers from a failure of warrant transmission. The argument is formally valid, sure, but the justification or warrant can't transmit from the premise to the conclusion.
Why not?
Because, they argue, the validity of the premise itself already presupposes the truth or justification of the conclusion.
Okay, let me try to walk through that, make sure I understand the mechanism.
Go for it.
So, under the traditional or conservative view, to be justified in believing here is a hand, I must already have some warrant for the background condition that I'm not being massively deceived. In other words, I need some reason to think that skepticism is false.
That's the conservative claim, yes.
So if I haven't already established that I'm not a brain in a vat, then I can't really be justified in believing I see a hand in the first place. Therefore, trying to use the premise I have a hand to prove I'm not deceived is just viciously circular.
It begs the question.
It begs the question against the skeptic. Who is doubting the very background conditions I need for my premise to have any force?
That is the classic diagnosis of Moore's proof, and it's a powerful one.
So what is the dogmatist's retort to that? How do they escape the charge of circularity?
They argue that this whole critique completely misfires against their theory. They claim that the immediate liberal warrant provided by the seeming is completely non-conditional.
Because it's immediate.
Because it's immediate. Since the warrant for "here is a hand" does not rely on any antecedent warrant for the external world's existence, it doesn't beg the question. The warrant for the premise is achieved without presupposing the conclusion.
So if dogmatism is right, the traditional view of Moore's proof as question-begging is just flat out wrong, and common sense wins.
That's their claim.
But if the conservatives are right, dogmatism fails at its very first, most important step.
It's a fundamental standoff. And that's what leads us directly into the deep disagreement that really characterizes a lot of contemporary epistemology.
Dogmatists on one side, claiming the high ground of common sense, and conservatives and skeptics on the other, insisting the whole project is question-begging from the start.
It's a deep mutual rejection. So to properly test dogmatism, we have to move beyond this impasse and look at an internal critique, one that challenges the logical consequences of their own position.
And that would be the easy knowledge objection.
Exactly. It's often articulated by Stuart Cohen, and it targets the very core commitment of dogmatism, that justification can be basic and immediate.
So this objection comes from within the non-skeptical camp.
Yes, which makes it much more interesting. To uphold this immediate justification for "here is a hand," dogmatism has to reject the conservative requirement. They reject that principle, KR, that says the reliability of a knowledge source must be known beforehand.
And rejecting that commits them to what you call a basic knowledge structure.
Yes, a structure where perceptual knowledge is just immediately available, no questions asked.
And the problem with basic knowledge is that it seems to license these conclusions that just feel intuitively wrong, or at least unwarranted. These are the easy knowledge inferences.
Right. Let's walk through the famous red table example. It makes it really clear.
Right.
So imagine you walk into a room and you see a table that looks red. Step 1, 1T is. The table seems red to me.
Simple enough. That's the seeming.
Step 2, 2T, according to dogmatism, is, therefore I'm justified in believing the table is red. That justification comes immediately from 1T, assuming no defeaters.
Okay, still with you.
Now step 3, 3T, is a simple logical truth. If the table is red, then it is not a white table that is being cleverly illuminated by hidden red lights.
That's just a logical entailment, true by definition.
And now from 2T and 3T, you can deduce the conclusion, 4T. Therefore, I am justified in believing the table is not white, but illuminated by red lights.
And there it is, the easy knowledge.
The easy knowledge. The problem here is that the knowledge you supposedly acquired in 4T feels incredibly flimsy, doesn't it?
It does. If someone actually challenged me on that point, hey, how do you know it's not just a white table under some tricky red lights? I couldn't really respond by saying, well, because I can see it's red. That answer feels completely unhelpful. It doesn't satisfy the challenge at all.
Exactly. Cohen's argument is that you lack a satisfactory response to the challenge. It feels like you haven't actually learned anything about the lighting conditions. You've just performed a bit of logical deduction on a very basic belief. The knowledge is acquired too easily.
Intuitively, you feel like you should have to do something else to rule out that possibility, like shine a different colored light on it, or check the room for hidden lamps.
Something, yes. Some kind of independent check, not just rely on the very perception that's being questioned.
And if this red table inference is so fishy, then the much grander Moorean proof is implicated too, because it follows the exact same logical pattern.
That's the wedge the critic drives in. The pattern is identical. I see a hand, therefore I am not a brain in a vat. If dogmatism wants to save Mooreanism, it has to bite the bullet and accept that all these closure-based inferences are valid, no matter how easy the knowledge seems.
This issue gets even worse, though. It leads to the problem of bootstrapping, which is something that even dogmatists generally want to avoid. Can you explain the mechanism of bootstrapping here?
Bootstrapping is a really troubling consequence. It's the possibility of using these repeated, easy knowledge inferences to somehow justify the reliability of your own perceptual faculties.
So you're using your eyesight to prove your eyesight works?
Essentially, yes. Under the dogmatic structure, it would work like this. Every time you see a red object, the visual seeming gives you immediate warrant for the belief that object is red.
Okay.
You can then make a little note. You can say, on this occasion, my sense of sight gave me a justified belief that P, and then I checked, and P was in fact true.
And you just run this little test over and over again?
Hundreds of times. You start with no warrant at all for believing your senses are reliable. That's the liberalism part.
Okay.
But then you systematically generate all these little justified beliefs about the world. And then you use that collection of justified beliefs to inductively support the general conclusion that your eyes must be reliable.
You've pulled yourself up by your own bootstraps.
Exactly. You've manufactured a justified belief in the reliability of your own faculties, seemingly out of thin air.
Wait, let me press on the circularity there because it seems blatant. If the initial input, the seeming, is only a reliable guide to truth if my eyes are working and I'm using the outputs of my eyes to prove that they're working, I haven't actually added any independent evidence into the system.
Yeah, I haven't.
It feels like using a potentially faulty scale to weigh itself over and over and then concluding the scale must be accurate because it keeps giving you the same number.
It is entirely circular. It seems to provide no real epistemic gain whatsoever. And that's why virtually all epistemologists, including most dogmatists, agree that bootstrapping is epistemically unacceptable. It can't be a legitimate way to gain knowledge.
But that puts the dogmatist in a very tight corner. To save more, they have to accept the easy knowledge inferences from the red table example. But if they accept that, how can they logically block the bootstrapping inference, which seems to follow the same logic?
That is the problem. They need to find a way to draw a line in the sand. So how do they escape?
I'm waiting.
They adopt a distinction, which was championed by James Pryor, between epistemic cogency and dialectical flaw.
Okay, what's that distinction?
They insist that the easy knowledge inferences are epistemically cogent. That means they really do successfully transfer justification and produce knowledge. They work on a purely logical epistemic level.
So the red table argument is, in fact, a good argument.
According to them, yes.
Yeah.
The reason it feels so wrong, so implausible, so unsatisfying is purely dialectical. It's just unpersuasive in a debate, especially against someone who already has doubts about your premises.
So the proof works, but it's just lousy rhetoric.
That is the core claim. And this claim is the engine that drives their really radical anti-skeptical strategy, which is the pathology claim.
The idea that skepticism is a philosophical disease.
Yes. They argue that skepticism isn't a valid philosophical position that you need to engage with logically. It's an intellectual disease. The skeptical opponent is suffering from a kind of epistemic delusion, and their doubts aren't motivated by good philosophical reasons, but by a pathological refusal to just accept common sense.
I have to challenge that directly. I mean, if we just declare our opponent diseased, aren't we just conceding that we can't actually beat their argument on rational grounds? Isn't that just a fancy way of admitting defeat by walking away from the table?
That is precisely the criticism that our sources are focusing on. The dogmatist retort is that anti-skeptical arguments do not need to convince the pathological skeptic in order to be legitimate.
So my argument can be good even if it convinces no one.
Pryor specifically says that begging the question is merely a dialectical vice, not an epistemic vice. Since dogmatism provides immediate justification, it hasn't begged the question epistemically, only rhetorically, in the context of a debate with a doubter.
So they are arguing for the right to not engage with the skeptical dialectic at all.
Exactly. They dismiss the opponent from the very outset. They're saying their position is not subject to a pathological critique.
This strategy seems central to their survival.
It's an absolute necessity. If they were to agree to defend their premises against a skeptic, they would lose the immediacy of their warrant. The whole thing would collapse back into conservatism. So their refusal to engage is baked into the theory.
Which means our job now is to figure out if this essential refusal is actually internally consistent with the rest of their theory.
Let's find out.
So if the dogmatist is right, if skepticism is just a philosophical disease, then we should expect that non-skeptical philosophers, people who, accept the existence of the external world, would find these easy knowledge inferences perfectly acceptable.
That's the logical conclusion, yes.
And yet that's not what we find. The philosophical literature is full of perfectly healthy and non-skeptical epistemologists who still find these inferences deeply suspicious. That unease persists.
And that persistent suspicion is a big red flag. It strongly suggests that the issue isn't just one of pathology or dialectics, but that there's an inherent epistemic flaw in the structure of the justification itself.
Okay, so to find that flaw, we have to get a bit more technical. We need to be precise about the kind of justification dogmatism claims to guarantee. And that's propositional justification, or GPT.
Right. It's crucial they focus on this.
Let's spend some time on this distinction. Why is the focus on GPT so important for their argument?
Okay, so propositional justification, JDP2, means that a subject, S, has sufficient epistemic reasons to believe a proposition, PP. It's about the entitlement to believe. The reasons are available to you.
It's distinct from doxastic justification.
Very distinct. Doxastic justification is about whether S actually formed the belief in a rational way based on those good reasons.
Can you give us an analogy for that?
Sure. Think of a lottery winner. Propositional justification is like being entitled to the prize money. You have the winning ticket, the reasons are there, it's valid. Doxastic justification is actually going to the lottery office, presenting the ticket, and cashing the check.
So you could have the winning ticket in your pocket but not know it, or you could believe you won because you dreamed it, not because you checked the numbers. In those cases, you'd have propositional justification but not doxastic justification.
Exactly. A person might have propositional justification for a complex mathematical theorem. The proof exists, it's sound. But if they only form the belief because, say, their favorite celebrity told them it was true, not because they understood the proof, they lack doxastic justification.
I see. And dogmatism has to cling to JPS because the immediate seeming provides a reason for belief, regardless of whether the subject uses that reason properly or even reflects on it at all.
Yes. This allows them to sidestep, at least initially, a lot of tricky worries about reflection and higher-order doubt. And that brings us to the example of the mediocre mathematician, Stan.
Stan the mathematician.
Stan is working on a proof. Let's say it's a simple reductio proof, proving that 2 is the only even prime number. He goes through the steps of his reasoning, and he gets this strong mathematical seeming that his conclusion is sound. It just feels right to him.
So, according to dogmatism, he has propositional justification for the proof's conclusion.
He does. The seeming provides it immediately.
But Stan is also self-aware. He's fully aware that he's a mediocre mathematician, that he makes mistakes all the time. He has this higher-order reflective doubt about his own mathematical reliability.
Right. So if you asked him, Stan, is your proof correct? He might suspend judgment. He'd say, I think so. It feels right, but I know I'm error-prone, so I'm not going to commit to it.
The internal feeling of correctness is strong, but his self-doubt is also strong.
And the dogmatist is rigidly, absolutely committed to the idea that Stan's propositional justification for the proof's conclusion is still there, full stop.
Why are they so committed to that point?
Because if that propositional justification vanished just because Stan started reflecting on his own abilities, then the seeming-based warrant wouldn't be direct or immediate anymore. It would become intellectualistic. It would depend on Stan first checking his own reliability, and that would destroy the entire core of dogmatism. It would be a collapse into conservatism.
But this seems to introduce a huge internal contradiction. If propositional justification means Stan has a good epistemic reason to believe Peep, how can that seeming possibly function as a good reason for him when he simultaneously has this powerful higher-order undercutting defeater?
That's the heart of the problem. Stan's reflective doubt isn't a defeater for the content of the proof. It's not like he found a mistake in his logic.
Right, it's not a first-order defeater.
It's a defeater for the justificatory power of the seeming itself. It's a higher-order undercutting defeater. If Stan knows his reasoning method often produces false positives, then the feeling of this seems correct cannot rationally serve as a good reason for him to believe it, even if the feeling is present.
So his own doubt seems capable of defeating the propositional justification itself.
It really does, which challenges the absolute immediacy of the warrant. If this kind of internal reflective doubt can defeat the warrant, then the warrant must be conditional on the absence of that doubt. And if it's conditional, it's not immediate.
We see this play out even more clearly in cases of known illusions. These seem devastating for the immediate warrant claim.
They are. Let's go back to the Miller-Lyer lines. The two lines that we know are the same length.
Right.
A sophisticated subject, someone who knows about the illusion, can measure the lines, they can know with certainty that they are equal, and yet the visual seeming that one is longer is still there. The phenomenal experience is fully present.
But it grants zero justification. No rational person who knows it's an illusion is justified in believing one line is longer.
Exactly. The seeming delivers absolutely no justificatory force in that context. And this proves that justification can be withheld even when the seeming is present, based on what the subject knows or justifiably believes about defeaters.
If the justification depends on that background knowledge,
Yeah.
then the core dogmatic feature, that warrant is immediate and direct, is in serious jeopardy. The dogmatist is forced to start classifying which seemings justify and which ones don't. And that process of classification requires assessing evidence and background knowledge, which makes the warrant indirect. It's no longer immediate.
The whole system seems to be unraveling. So what's the maneuver? How do they try to save the position from collapsing into conservatism?
They're forced into a retreat to a more subtle position, sometimes called elusive justification. Thinkers like Luca Moretti have proposed this. It's basically a compromise.
Okay, a compromise. What does that look like?
Moretti suggests that, yes, the seeming-based warrant is immediate, and it does provide propositional justification. But this justification is extremely delicate. It's elusive.
Delicate how?
Reflection makes it vanish. The moment you adopt even a minimal reflective stance on your seeming, the justification disappears.
Because the act of reflection itself makes the potential for the seeming to be deceptive, the undercutting defeater, immediately available to you as a rational thinker. The minute you step back and think, wait, can I trust this seeming? Yeah, you realize the skeptic's challenge is a live possibility, and your justification is defeated.
That is a fascinatingly strange position. So the claim is that dogmatism is epistemically sound, but only for the non-reflective, perhaps for the epistemically oblivious.
That's one way to put it.
So if I just go about my day, unthinkingly, I'm justified in believing the world is as it seems. But the moment I take an intro to philosophy class and gain this higher order awareness, I lose all my justification. That sounds like a philosophy of blissful ignorance.
It does have that flavor, and that is the implication. Moorean reasoning on this view is still technically epistemically cogent, but it's rendered completely ineffective for reflective subjects. The dogmatist can still maintain that justification was there, but your active reflection defeated it.
It's a way to maintain the structural claim of immediate warrant while conceding the psychological and dialectical point that reflection just destroys its utility.
It's a clever move, but this entire maneuver only holds up if we accept the unproven foundational assumption. The assumption that the seeming should have provided warrant in the first place, before reflection came along.
Which brings us right back around to what seems to be the most critical structural flaw in the whole system.
The unargued-for assumption of basic knowledge.
Absolutely. The true issue isn't really the easy knowledge inferences themselves. The issue is the prior commitment to basic knowledge. The assumption that P, the seeming, automatically entails JBR, a justified belief in the reliability of the source without offering any defense for that entailment.
The dogmatist just assumes this key step, and that assumption is what needs justification.
And if that assumption is left undefended, the entire theory risks collapsing into sheer arbitrariness. And this is where we have to transition from just fighting the external whistle skeptic to fighting the deeper structural problem of epistemic criteria itself. If the entire validity of dogmatism rests on this assumed entailment, this P implies JBR, then what dogmatism is really arguing is that this specific rule, this principle PC, is the correct and fundamental criterion for all justification.
That's the critical realization you have to come to. When they endorse PC, they are endorsing it as a valid, non-arbitrary criterion for what counts as epistemic justification.
And any philosopher who proposes a foundational criterion like that has an intellectual obligation to provide some kind of rational support for it.
They absolutely do. If you don't offer any rational support, then your choice of PC is just arbitrary. It's a dogmatic assertion in the pejorative sense of the word. You're just stamping your foot and saying, this is how it is.
And this demand for rational support for our most basic standards of knowledge, that is the very definition of the ancient problem of the criterion.
Indeed. The problem of the criterion, which was formalized by Sextus Empiricus way back when, and more recently by Roderick Chisholm, it really encapsulates the most fundamental skeptical challenge of all. It revolves around the difficult rational relationship between two questions.
Question A, what do we know? Which is about the extent of our knowledge.
And question B, how do we decide whether we know? Which is about the criterion for knowledge.
And the problem is the vicious circle, the dilemma of rational undecidability that this creates. Can you walk us through how that circle works?
It creates a trilemma, really. 3 possible starting points, and none of them seem rationally satisfying on their own. First, you could start with question B. You could be a Methodist.
Meaning you start by choosing a method or a criterion like sense perception is reliable.
Right. But how do you know that your chosen method is a reliable one? To know that, you either have to already assume you know some instances of knowledge that were produced by that method.
Which is circular because you're using the method to justify the method.
Or you have to rely on some other higher order criterion to justify your first one, which just leads to an infinite regress. You can't justify the rule unless you already trust the results of the rule.
Okay, so what's the other option?
The other option is to start with A. You could be a particularist. You start by claiming to know specific things. For example, G.E. Moore's "I know I have a hand."
But to claim that instance as a piece of genuine knowledge, you must have already, at least implicitly, assumed some criterion, some answer to question B, that allows for that kind of thing to count as knowledge.
So you can't have confidence in your particular result unless you trust the rule that produced it. You can't trust the rule unless you trust the results.
It's a perfect loop. The skeptic's position, then, isn't necessarily that knowledge is impossible. It's that we can't seem to rationally decide what criterion to accept or what instance of knowledge to privilege.
That's the power of it. It's a profound structural dilemma. It is not a psychological disorder. And this is the exact reason why the dogmatist's pathology claim ultimately fails. The problem of the criterion is a legitimate, non-pathological, deeply difficult epistemological concern that every theory of justification has to face.
So given that trilemma, where does dogmatism fit in?
Dogmatism is a classic variety of particularism. It explicitly rejects Methodism. That's what conservatism is, because it rejects the need for an antecedent warrant for its methods.
So it starts from presumed instances of knowledge. It privileges question A over question B.
Exactly. They say we start from the fact that we know we have hands, and our seemings are what give us that knowledge.
But by adopting PC as its foundational criterion to do that work, dogmatism is now, whether it likes it or not, necessarily engaged in the problem of the criterion. It has picked its starting point.
It has chosen its side. It has picked A, and therefore it must be prepared to defend the implicit criterion B that it's relying on. It has to defend that choice against other philosophers who chose a different criterion, or against the skeptic who, quite rationally, refuses to choose at all.
And this is the devastating critique of their whole avoidance strategy. The moment the dogmatist proposes PC as a non-arbitrary rule for justification, they have entered the philosophical arena. They've stepped into the ring.
Which fundamentally contradicts their core anti-skeptical strategy of wholesale rejection of the skeptical dialectic. They simply cannot sustain this refusal to engage with the skeptic when they have so actively chosen a side in the most fundamental skeptical challenge of all the criterion dialectic.
It's the ultimate irony, isn't it? They try to write themselves out of the debate, but by asserting a foundational principle, they've automatically bought themselves a front row ticket to the most difficult philosophical debate there is.
And to uphold their refusal to engage, they would literally have to withdraw their position from all epistemic evaluation. They'd have to admit that their choice of PC is just arbitrary. Of course, that would mean surrendering its status as a meaningful theory of justification, so they're compelled to defend it.
So the deep dissatisfaction we all feel with easy knowledge and Moorean proofs, it isn't just that they're dialectically weak, as prior claims.
No, it's that they rely on this crucial assumption. This P implies JBR, whose epistemic worth has been arbitrarily declared, not rationally evaluated. The arbitrary nature of the starting point is the real epistemic flaw.
Now, a potential defense for the dogmatist might be to say, we're shifting the goalposts here. They might say, look, we only wanted to ignore external world skepticism, the Cartesian brain and vat stuff. The problem of the criterion is a much more general meta-theoretical problem about standards. Can't we fight one without fighting the other?
That's a plausible objection to consider. It tries to create a separation between these different forms of skepticism. And historically, Cartesian doubt does focus more on the veracity of perception, while Pyrrhonism focuses more on criteria.
But you're saying that separation breaks down here?
It breaks down completely once dogmatism enters the conversation.
Why? What's the necessary link?
Because the problem of the criterion is about the justification for believing any fact. And dogmatism is a particularist theory whose chosen criterion, PC, is specifically designed to justify beliefs about external world propositions. The whole point of PC is to give you justification for claims like, here's a hand.
I see the link now. So if dogmatism were to successfully defend its criterion, PC, in the criterion debate, then having a justified belief in an ordinary proposition like here is a hand would trivially entail the denial of external world skepticism.
Thanks to the closure principle and those easy knowledge inferences we talked about earlier, So engagement with the Criterion dialectic is engagement with the external world skeptic. You cannot defend your answer to question B without simultaneously validating your answers to question A, which are the very claims that refute the skeptic. The two battles are completely intertwined.
Which means the dogmatist actually has two anti-skeptical options on the table. They have a direct, overriding refutation based on their criterion, or they have the dismissive strategy of calling the skeptic pathological. This brings us back to what you called the asymmetry puzzle.
Right. If they truly believe their criterion is non-arbitrary and gives them immediate justification for their premise, and that this premise logically refutes skepticism, why do they prefer the dismissive strategy? Why throw away the direct refutation?
The only logical reason would be that they sense on some level that the direct refutation is ineffective, that it falls flat.
That it feels question-begging or circular, which is the traditional conservative critique.
Exactly. But if the direct refutation is defective, then that suspicion has to trace back to the foundational criterion it's based on. You can't say the criterion is perfectly sound, but the direct logical application of it is somehow flawed.
The dogmatist wants to have it both ways. They want to say the criterion, PC, is epistemically perfect, but its application in the Moorean proof is merely dialectically ineffective. But if your foundational warrant is so flimsy that it can't even support a direct refutation without seeming circular, how solid can that foundation really be?
It seems like the dismissive strategy isn't an independent alternative at all.
It's more like the coda of the criterion-based refutation. Dogmatism only licenses ignoring the skeptic because they assume their criterion has already delivered a refutation, even if the skeptic is too diseased to accept it. That's not avoiding the debate. It's a form of limited selective participation that tries to hide a potentially fatal flaw in its own justificatory criterion.
Okay, let's flip it around. If we completely exclude the fight over criteria, can external world skepticism pose a credible threat on its own, just through scenario skepticism, just the brain in a vat doubt, pure and simple?
Well, if the skeptic relies only on the imaginative scenario of massive deception, they have to implicitly adopt some very high, very contentious standards for justification.
For example?
For instance, they might be relying on infallibilism, the idea that justification requires ruling out all logically possible ways you could be wrong. Or they might appeal to evidential symmetry, claiming our evidence is identical in the good case, seeing a real hand, and the bad case being a vat brain.
But those claims, infallibilism, evidential symmetry, those are themselves complex epistemic theses. They are, in effect, alternative criteria for justification.
They absolutely are. So targeting a pure scenario-based skepticism is like fighting a cardboard box opponent. Real, lasting philosophical skepticism gets its traction, not from the weirdness of the scenarios themselves, but from the fact that we lack a settled, rationally defended foundational criterion to non-arbitrarily dismiss those scenarios.
The force of the skeptical argument isn't the sci-fi plot, it's the feeling that we lack the proper grounds to reject it.
And that's where the underdetermination principle, or UJ, comes into play. UJ states that to be justified, you have to be able to non-arbitrarily reject competing hypotheses. If your foundational criterion of justification, like PC, is unsettled and seems arbitrary, then the skeptical alternative that you're being deceived is an equally plausible competitor. You can't non-arbitrarily reject it.
So external world skepticism gets its power precisely when the foundational criterion is up for grabs.
Which confirms our whole analysis. Dogmatism cannot consistently reject the skeptical dialectic. Its core tenet, that epistemic cogency is unaffected by dialectical prowess, is severely weakened, because the problem isn't rhetorical, it's structural. By offering a particularist criterion, the dogmatist has stepped into the criterion dialectic and must defend the validity of its own rules against all comers, pathological or not.
The fundamental flaw, then, is the failure to defend the basic knowledge assumption. The moment the dogmatist assumes that a seeming provides non-conditional warrant, they have asserted a specific answer to question B, how do we know? And they now owe the philosophical community a justification for that answer.
And refusing to engage in that context isn't a victory for common sense. It's an admission that your system can't withstand rational scrutiny.
So this deep dive has, I think, meticulously mapped out the internal contradictions of epistemological dogmatism's anti-skeptical strategy. The theory just cannot consistently reject the skeptical dialectic. Because its very foundation, this idea of immediate warrant from seemings, requires it to engage with the inescapable problem of the criterion.
Right. And it's important to be clear about what we've shown. We didn't reject the possibility of liberal warrant or immediate justification outright. That's still a very live and open debate in epistemology.
Good point.
What our sources show is that the specific anti-skeptical strategy of dogmatism, the dismissal of the skeptic as diseased, fails. It fails because it tries to avoid the necessary defense of its own basic principles, a defense that is demanded by the problem of the criterion.
The moment dogmatism chose PC as its foundational standard, it moved from just asserting a personal philosophical preference to proposing a universal rule for what counts as knowledge. And once you propose a rule for the game, you have to be prepared to defend that rule against other players who propose alternative rules.
And so the real infelicity, the real problem with Moorean reasonings and easy knowledge inferences is revealed to be much deeper than a technical failure of warrant transmission.
They remain epistemically suspicious.
Because they rely on this crucial, unverified assumption, the validity of their chosen criterion for basic epistemic warrant. This is a legitimate problem of establishing satisfactory standards, one that even non-skeptical reflective thinkers have to address.
Which leaves us with a final, provocative thought for you, the learner. If philosophy requires us to establish satisfactory standards for basic epistemic warrant before we can accept the conclusions that follow from them, what are your foundational criteria? When does a simple observation, the coffee cup on your desk, the sun shining outside, become a truly justified belief?
The fight against skepticism, it turns out, may ultimately be a fight for justified foundations. The dogmatist wanted to win by walking off the field. Our analysis shows that to even participate in the game of knowledge, you have to be prepared to defend the rulebook first.
Thank you for joining us for this rigorous deep dive. We'll see you next time.